now turned on. We have our bios, so without much further ado, I am going to ask Cindy to begin.
Okay.
You're number one.
Oh, boy.
I won't start the timer until you're ready, though.
Well, yeah. Hey, Liz must have done that because
Yes.
it's already up and ready.
I think she's prepped you.
Okay, we'll make this quick. I just wanted to talk a little bit about measurement and migration, and particularly migration estimation techniques. I'm very appreciative of our colleague Andrei Korobkov, who helped a few months back, as well as Vladimir Mukhamel, organize a workshop in Moscow for journalists with funding from the Voice of America, really looking at kind of the basic question, where do migration numbers come from? Unless we have a better idea on how we measure migration, it's really hard to get to evidence-based policy, as Ellen mentioned this morning. So, some core assumptions and some questions. I assume migration statistics are important. I think they ought to be accurate as well. They shape public discourse, they shape policy discussions, and they provide the basis for program budgeting. And I think that's really important, and as Blair alluded to earlier, it's something that really integrates the interests of regional officials. But then we have questions. How are these estimates done? Are there systematic variations by method, by source? What are the political and economic implications of, quote, muddling through migration estimates, or basically just kind of looking at numbers until you pick one that just feels right? I think we can do better than that. Migration matters, and as Tony Blair was famous for saying, although he didn't succeed in immigration reform in England, a simple way to take a measure of a country is to look at how many people want in and how many people want out. Fairly clear, right? Both Obama and Putin have thought about immigration in a wide variety of ways, but I think Obama's quote here, when he was still a candidate, is really insightful. We've got 12 million people who live in the shadows. If we don't deal with them, we're going to have a constant problem. Putin just recently has been much more aggressive. You know, we've got all the legislative opportunities to implement tougher migration rules, and we're going to do it. So they're going to make these rules, and there's data everywhere, right? This is like Alice in kind of an anti-Wonderland. Everyone's got a number about statistics. 1 in 10 migrants has AIDS or tuberculosis. We have, apologies to those of you from Arizona, Senator Pierce from Arizona getting on the floor of Congress and claiming that illegal immigrants commit more serious crime than legal residents based on incarceration records, which, you know, you can't do. Maybe they're just bad criminals and they get caught more often.
It's hard to believe no one brought up Arizona before now.
We were waiting for you. Can we really critique these numbers without clear estimates? And more frighteningly, given that they are numbers, people will remember them. And I put this quote up from Twain because we all think this quote comes from Mark Twain. There are 3 kinds of lies: damn lies, and damn lies, and statistics. It's not from Mark Twain. Mark Twain himself attributes it to Disraeli, right? So we don't know where this stuff comes from. We miscite it, we misremember it, but it's a fact, and we're going to construct migration policy on it. This is a problem, and it's a lack of clear estimates can be difficult. They constrain evidence-based policy, they preclude informed public opinion, and they prevent accurate budgeting and planning again. So how can we estimate? How can we get a handle on this population? As was pointed out in the previous panel, our survey of labor migrants in the Russian Federation can't start to pretend to be representative because we don't know how many labor migrants there are. We certainly don't know their gender composition, we don't know their nationality, we don't know their duration. We have a paucity of information. This is not a situation that's unknown to anyone who lives in the Southwest of the United States. As a former resident of the state of Texas, I take this question very, very seriously, particularly as a demographer in Texas. So how can we estimate? Generally, we think about 5 different types of data that the US has used: statistics, census data, surveys, apprehension data from the border, and indirect indicators, tax records, schools, hospital records, etc. All of these are quite limited. Whoa, I'm sorry. I have to turn that and turn that. There we go. There is no perfect solution. Neither Eurostat nor the US Census has come up with the magic bullet for estimating the unestimable. But there are 4 sources of indirect estimations of the migrant population in the USA that have been highlighted by scholars across the board as having extremely clear and useful methodology. Some of them are rejected out of hand, but I think that showing these 4 approaches can help us understand a little bit better where these numbers come from in the US case. The US Census Department employs demographic analysis, again using the American Community Survey, which is a national survey that asks about the where you were born. It has nativity information on it. They do not factor legality or registration into their estimation, so they just come up with an estimate of migrants. Fair enough. The Pew Trust estimates, which are done by Jeffrey Passell, again with many colleagues, including some of my former colleagues from Texas, Frank Bean and Jennifer Van Hook, focuses on the March Current Population Survey. And the March Current Population Survey is the one with all the labor market information in it. To that, they incorporate census data, mortality information, data from the primary sending country of Mexico, as well as the American Community Survey for data on foreign-born under the age of 16. Again, Pew and Passell, they do not differentiate whether you're registered or unregistered, so we just get migrants. Homeland Security is a more recent player in the migration estimation game, and they rely, again, on the American Community Survey. They use a residual approach, and they come up with separate estimates for legal and unauthorized. So they look at the foreign-born, they look at their age structure, they make some corrections for sampling, and then they go to records about who came in legally, and either you came in illegally or you're illegal. Based on the results of the survey, they project that out for the entire US population. Luckily, some time ago, Bear Stearns decided to get into the migration estimation game because, investment banks are so good at predicting quantitative approaches, and we know we can trust them explicitly. And indeed, their estimates were just about as reliable as one might get from an investment bank. They focused on remittances, and their approach was, we can't count the people, but we can count the money going out. And we can estimate the size of the remittances, and then we can extrapolate back to the number of migrants. The Bear Stearns approach is the one that that generated the highest estimates, 20 million migrants, far out and away outside other estimates. What about the Russian Federation? We do have information, limited as it may be, on border statistics. This is for people who cross the border from visa-free countries or with a visa from a sending country. We have studies like Krasenitz did in 1997, which is an expert assessment trying to get together migration experts and get their idea about how many migrants there are. The Federal Migration Service, until very recently, did not have a projections working group. They didn't have a group of demographers, although they are building one, and that's to their credit. The State Statistical Survey, I can't get away from Gascomstat, in 2010 started their Committee on Scientific Methods, and they've had 6 different training sessions on different ways to propose to estimate migration. We have enormous enormous potential in terms of quality, independent scholarly assessments, some of them done by people in this room. But there are far fewer national longitudinal data sources. We don't have something like the American Community Survey in the US. In the United States, our estimates, this is from 1994 to 2012, vary dramatically. And again, this research was undertaken with my esteemed colleague, Professor Hoffman. And what we have here is some estimates over time and where they came from. You can see that one up at 20 million, again, is the Bear Stearns remittance estimation. But in general, you can see, while there's some variation, the standard deviation is not huge. Whether it's an academic or a government source or the INS, the estimates seem to track fairly well. Not surprisingly, in the Russian Federation, we find much more variance in terms of the numbers and the estimates of migration being all over the map. Indeed, looking at mass media reports, we find that close to elections, the spread of migrant estimates tends to get bigger. This is something that people have reported in the state of Texas as well. Migration numbers are highly political, and depending on your orientation, you will estimate them higher or lower. But again, this does not look like a great basis for evidence-based policy. How can we measure migration? We can clarify our definitions. I think this is a really beneficial area for collaboration. This is a situation in the United States that's quite tenuous as well. For those of you who are familiar with the American Community Survey, you may recall 6 months ago, somebody tried to get it defunded in Congress. There was a lot of jokes about the fact that we didn't need to ask people whether they had a flush toilet in their house. This is America, we don't ask those questions. That was just a smokescreen. The American Community Survey is the standard for estimating migration in the United States. And by trying to get that out of the way, they were really trying to put a squash on getting accurate information on migration. So, interesting political shenanigans can take place regardless of the country. I think they're pretty much, again, a great area for comparative research. What we need to do, and what we worked on with the journalists that we had the pleasure of meeting in Moscow, was really trying to focus people on analytic estimates, which are based on a replicable estimation method, and trying to dissuade people from using speculative estimates, or in Russian we would say "мне так кажется," right? I think it's right around something else. This is particularly important as we move forward on migration. So what are some of the possibilities that are explored both in the US as well as in Russia? Regional variation in the number of pension accounts. Now, in working with the pension system in Nizhny Novgorod, I was told on several occasions that there were smaller administrative districts that actually had more pension accounts paid in, so people were paying in on fictive pension accounts, than there were people of working ages who lived in that region. So clearly some migrants perhaps were registered under a false identity number and were paying into the pension system. This is a standard practice in the United States, and Social Security would be lost without it. But it's, again, an avenue into trying to get an idea of where unregistered migrants are concentrated. With access to individual census records and more information on the foreign-born, we might be able to move forward towards better projections. Right now, in the Russian Federation, there is not standard access to individual census records like the PUMS data in the United States. US has had some success with school-based surveys. Thanks. We can try extrapolation techniques by Bean, Van Hook, and others. We can share questions on national longitudinal surveys, as Susan is involved in right now. And we can look at linked analyses with sending country surveys. In terms of concluding thoughts, just want to point out that getting these numbers might not be the most tantalizing topic in migration studies, but it's really critical, and getting at better demographic analytical estimations could be extraordinarily useful. So just some concluding thoughts, right? We've got to examine the estimation approaches in comparison. I think the United States can improve their standard estimation techniques by looking at how they fit or don't fit in other countries, looking at where the lines of demarcation fall. We need to think about systematic approaches to invite useful comparisons in terms of processes, outcomes, similarities, and differences. But I think the last two questions are also really important. We need to think very critically as scholars about who benefits by the absence of comprehensive immigration information. There's a reason why these studies don't get funded very often, and it's not just because budgets are tight. On both the conservative and liberal sides, we have competing political interests. And lastly, I think we can actually answer this question: who benefits from the establishment of more systematic efforts? Everyone. Everyone from individual ombudsmen in a specific city to tax planners to policy people at all levels. And so I think that that's an area ripe for collaboration and possibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cindy. And you get the award for sticking the closest to 15 minutes today. I'd like to ask our next speaker to join us. And Alexandra's from the Institute of Economics, the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Urals branch.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation and the honor to be here today. I'm going to be speaking about a migration self-regulation model, which we have designed for studying effects of liberalization of the migratory legislation. I want to begin with highlighting the importance of analyzing such effects. The latter half of the 20th century saw liberalization in immigrant intake and citizenship acquisition regulation in many immigrant-receiving countries. More recently, countries such as Denmark, the Netherlands, the UK, and the USA have tightened up citizenship acquisition rules and immigrant intake regulation. Have had witnessed declines in the employment probabilities for immigrants. In contrast, Sweden has continued to liberalize citizenship acquisition regulations, most recently recognizing dual citizenship, while at the same time seeing decline employment prospects for immigrants. Canada has a long-standing history of fairly liberal citizenship regulation, demanding a relatively short period of residency before citizenship acquisition is possible, and recognizing dual citizenship. A decisive step towards the liberalization of the immigration policy in Russia was made in 2007. The essence of the liberal measures is presented briefly on the slide. The changes led to simplified procedures of registration and employment, especially for migrants from CIS states. In the case of liberalization of the immigration policy, the economy of the host country benefits from low-paid labor migrants, but this liberalization lowers the effectiveness of the empowered authorities' control and supervising activities, causing growth in the number of illegal immigrants in host countries. Recent estimates reported on the slide show that Russia is the second after the USA in the number of stock of illegal immigrants and the first in the percentage of the total number of foreigners represented by illegals. As immigration has become a main public concern in most developed economies, policymakers seek to manage immigrant population. To enlarge the evidence base for policymakers, we've designed a migration self-regulation model which aims to study effects of liberalization of the immigration policy. In my report, I will first capture a theoretical framework that helps us to develop the model. Second, I will discuss the related literature to reveal our contribution. Third, I will set out the migration self-regulation model in detail. Fourth, I will describe Russian regions and CIS states data we have used to analyze such effects. Then I will tell you about calibration of the model and simulating results of migration flows and wage levels for Russian regions and CIS states, and finally turn to conclusion. So let's get started. Answering question how to study effect of liberalization of the immigration policy, we've tried to form a theoretical framework of our model. The liberal development model is focused on all democratic values. This model is based on a human rights paradigm that supports a priority of human rights over citizen rights. The right to free movement as one of the basic rights in a democratic society should prevail over a division of rights by nationality non-nationality principle in a pure liberal model. The liberal development model assumes elimination of all barrier for free movement of the labor force. At the same time, such free movement of labor migrants is considered as movement of production factors in the neoclassical economics of migration in a common market. According to the neoclassical economics, a migration decision is based on a expected income gained from the earning gap between source and host countries. However, according to the standard theory of equilibrium wages based on a labor demand and supply framework, inflow of immigrants' labor into a certain group will reduce the relative wage of native workers belonging to that group, with the size of the wage reduction determined by the degree of substitution between immigrant and native workers, with similar. Considered approaches allow studying effects of liberalization of immigration policy. So we believe immigration self-regulation model should be established within the framework of the neoclassical economics of migration and the standard theory of equilibrium wages. Several neoclassical economic studies of migration have developed migration models in which immigrant workers respond to cross-regional differences in wages, migration costs, and the labor market situation in source and host countries. There is a growing body of literature that analyzes the effects of migration on the region and destination countries and their labor markets. Our research contributes to the literature by developing the migration self-regulation model, which predicts the dynamic of migration determined by wage differentials and labor market situation, as well as the dynamic of wage levels determined by migration simultaneously for source and host countries. More importantly, in models mentioned above, a potential migrants from just one region searches for a job in other region, while our model stresses simultaneous searches of potential migrants from more than one region in more than one region. So our model can predict changes to the region composition of migration flow, which will be determined by a competition of migrants from different regions. I draw your attention to the next slide, where we offer a migration self-regulation model in continuous time. The model is constructed on the evolutionary game dynamics of migration flow. It assumes that the central institution of migration self-regulation is the labor market. Additionally, as institution of migration self-regulation, we consider migratory networks. We examine a common market where migrants are economically rational and they go to work in a region where a wage level is higher, taking into account migration cost. To simplify, migrants are not divided into skill groups and therefore they are considered as workers with similar skills, where previous and recent immigrants seems to be substitutes. So new immigrants will reduce the wage level on the labor market in the host region. So the labor migration flow from source country I to the host country J is defined according to the equation presented on the slide. Let's consider model features. According to this first multiplier, a migration flow is inversely proportional to the distance between capitals of source country and host region. Previous research of population migration has already shown that a large distance increases the financial and psychological cost of migrating and gathering information, which is likely to have a negative impact on the scale of population migration. The second multiplier describes migration inflow supported by migrant networks, which act as informal promoters of their compatriots in the labor markets. Thereby, existing migrants' population abroad creates beneficial network effects. According to the expression in the first brackets, immigration flows is limited by the number of potential migrants who would like to move to another country for temporary work. According to the expression in the second bracket, the equilibrium solution in the present model is driven by the wage equating force of migration. Labor migration flows does not stop until wage levels between source country and host region have equated. Wage in host region are modeled as a function of the labor migrant inflow presented on the slide. According to this function, immigration increases labor supply and reduces probability to get job in host region. The probability counts according to the expression in brackets. As a result, the wage in the host region decreases. It is reasonable to expect that the wage in source country increases with labor migrant outflow, according to the expression presented on the slide. The code of the model was programmed in MATLAB to test whether the model is consistent with empirical regularities. The model was calibrated on Russian regions and CIS states. Employing a developed model to Russian region and CIS states requires a large set of data. Sources of using data is presented on the slide. We include such CIS states as Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine. Between 2007 and 2010, individuals born in these states constitute from 60 to 70% of the foreign labor force in Russia. We use data for Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Sversk region, where about 40% of the foreign labor force of Russia is concentrated. Employing the data to Russian region and C states, we've tried to analyze the effects of liberalization of migration policy in Russia. So the model was calibrated on Russian region and CIS states data for the period since 2006 and 2008. This period is characterized by a considerable migrant inflow from CIS states due to liberalization of migration policy. So we believe this period exactly reflects the effects of this liberalization and could be successfully applied for calibration. Calibrating the model, we've received meaning of scale coefficient for the host region, and the accuracy of the model constitutes 95% of the absolute value of the migration flows. The forecast trajectories of migration flows to Russia region from the CIS countries have been received for the period since 2010 to 2016. Predicting situation in Moscow and St. Petersburg are similar. The largest migratory inflow from Uzbekistan, blue line, will remain in both of them at first. Steadily over time, a migratory inflow from Ukraine, black line, will have exceeded, which caused the greatest number of potential migrants there, and a geographic contiguity of Ukraine and these states. At the same time, more and more migrants from Western CIS states prefer go to European countries. So, future migration inflows from Ukraine might be lower than predicted one. The number of foreign labor force in Moscow will have reached 700,000 persons to 2016. In St. Petersburg, the total number of foreign labor force will have made up 580,000 persons to 2016. Because of geographic contiguity of Sversk region and Central Asia, the origin composition of the foreign labor force in Sversk region will be different. Uzbekistan, which has the greatest number of potential migrants in Central Asia, will have become the leading migrant-setting country. The total number of foreign labor forces in the Sversk region will have made up 230,000 persons to 2016. Differences in wages between the source countries and the host regions causing the number and the region composition of the foreign labor force are presented on the slide. According to received results, the effects of migration on wage levels will take place mainly in the host region. Economic growth of Azerbaijan, red thin line, and Kazakhstan, green thin line, where the wage levels are the highest among the source countries, resulted in lowering of migration to Russia from these states, as well as Kazakhstan becoming a preferred destination for many of the Central Asian labor migrants, first of all for the Uzbeks. Employing a developed model to Russian region and CIS states data, we've tried to analyze the effects of liberalization of the migration policy in Russia. The predicted migration of labor force from CIS states to Russian regions looks quite realistic, so we believe these findings have important policy consequences, in particular because of the lack of reliable methods for calculating the demand for foreign labor force. The forecast of migration flows can be used for developing work permit quotas. In reality, small work permit quotas for migrants from CIS with a visa-free regime of entry, instead of providing job opportunity for Russians, will provoke a growth of illegal employment practices in Russia. we can think at least 3 lines along which our model could be extended. First, migration costs should be taken into account. Second, a wage function should be developed and take into account the elasticity between wages and foreign labor supply. Finally, migrants should be classified into skill groups. However, this possible extension are left for future research. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to any question and open for collaboration. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Misha Sava from the Kuban State University, channeled through Oliver. And Misha was a key informant and of great assistance to us, Oliver and I, when we were in Krasnodar doing the case study. So there's some wonderful poetry here that Oliver is now channeling. Misha.
Спасибо. Дорогие коллеги, мой доклад представит доктор Оливер Беван, которому я за это очень благодарен. Но еще больше вы должны быть ему за это благодарны, потому что его английский намного лучше моего, конечно.
Чуть-чуть.
Я хотел бы вначале сказать, что те выводы, которые будут представлены в этом докладе, являются результатом более чем десятилетней работы с 2001 года Южного регионального ресурсного центра.
Professor Sava, thanks you all for your attention. The conclusions that we're going to present today are the result of more than 10 years' work as a result of the Southern Russian Research Center.
Эта работа включала в себя как научные исследования проблем миграции, так и практическую деятельность по правовой помощи мигрантам в Краснодарском крае и на юге России.
So the work is the product both of formal scholarly research and the assistance that Professor Sava and his organization afford to immigrants in Krasnodar and the southern Russian region.
И мне остается только добавить, что в течение последних 2 лет очень важные выводы мы получили благодаря тому, что я, как член общественной наблюдательной комиссии Краснодарского края, получил возможность инспектировать тюрьмы, то есть места лишения свободы.
So in particular, important results have arisen from his work over the past 2 years as part of the Public Supervisory Committee, in which capacity he's been able to visit deportation centers where people are held in prisons and talk to them.
На территории Краснодарского края 4 таких депортационных центра, где я регулярно бываю, и люди, находящиеся там, стали не только объектом нашей помощи, но и важнейшим источником информации.
So there are 4 such centers in Krasnodar, and the people there have been both the recipients of help from Mikhail's organization and also an important source of information for his research.
Спасибо, Оливер, пожалуйста.
Thank you, Professor Sava. It's with great pleasure that I'm honored to present the work of this important paper to you all today. I realize it's a Friday, and believe me, as an Englishman, I know what Friday nights mean, so I will try and make this as brief as possible. Having said that, I do think it's a useful way of tying together some of the major themes we've seen today. So Mikhail's work stands very much at the intersection of scholarly research and policy analysis, as he mentioned. And I think there's some really important findings that come out from the work that he's been conducting in Krasnodar and the southern Russia as a whole. So this paper was actually the result of a conference that was held in Tashkent in 2011, where a number of workers... am I going too fast? Sorry, I know am I okay? All right. If I'm going too fast, please wave at me. So there was a conference in Tashkent in 2011 which Mikhail attended along with other major researchers and policy activists concerning migration, and this paper comes out of the very fruitful discussions they had there. So the slides aren't long, but there's a lot of information, so I crave your pardon for the somewhat cluttered nature. So Mikhail's paper really does two things, one of which is to define the new reality for migrants in southern Russia, and then the second thing is to think about the policy implications that result from that new reality. As the slide says, there are really three core aspects of what he sees as the emerging reality for migrants in southern Russia. The first of these is the very weak economic position that many of the migrants find themselves in. We've heard from many speakers today about the kind of situations that migrants face when they move to a new country. We've heard that their remittances don't typically pick up until they're settled. And one of the problems that they have is this temporary slavery that Professor Sava discusses. Temporary slavery entails when the migrants are forced to hand over their passports and legal documents to a middleman who then says that he or she, typically he, will take care of any legal problems that they face. Obviously, this puts them in an incredibly weak position if they are run into a problem with the authorities, if they have any concerns about their contracts, their wages. And this is a serious, serious problem for migrants in Krasnodar. As we've heard already, Krasnodar is one of the provinces where we see increasing amounts of violence against migrants. There's also been, because of Sochi, because of the Winter Olympics, which will happen in the near future, there's been a tremendous influx of foreign migrants into the region. So these problems are very actual and very real. The second thing, and I think this is something we've talked a bit about today but deserves greater attention, is that migrants from Central Asia to Russia no longer share the same cultural and linguistic commonalities that would have been the case 20 or even 10 years ago. I think a very good question was asked about why we don't start asking people from 18 years ago what their experiences are. So the younger migrants from Central Asia don't speak Russian, typically. They're educated in their native language. We see they also typically don't have university education. I think Erin's presentation was particularly helpful in terms of demographics there. So these are people who don't really connect very well with the local communities. They don't have the ability to converse with them, which obviously, again, if you get in contract disputes, it's really hard to resolve contract disputes if you can't communicate with your boss. They also don't have the same cultural assumptions anymore. So under the Soviet Union, there was, broadly speaking, one system of governance, one expectation about the kind of legal frameworks in which people operated. That's no longer the case. These are people who come from very different political regimes, very different cultural and social environments, and when they move to Russia, they face serious challenges in terms of integration. And the third one is that Professor Sava's research has estimated that around 25% of new migrants are seeking to stay in Russia. That's an extraordinary proportion and something which wasn't typically the case before. And this is, again, increasing tensions with locals. There are a number of different factors, one of which is competition for women in southern Russia. So when you have typically influx of young men, you do see tensions breaking out with, strangely enough, with other young men. Usually the most relaxed part of any population, but so speak from experience. So this is really the framework which Professor Sava would like people to think about how migrants are integrating into Russia, the kind of problems they face, and why this is a real issue. These are very, very difficult problems to solve. They're born of cultural linguistic dissimilarities, very weak economic positions, and competition over scarce resources. So this is a serious, serious issue facing the southern Russia and Krasnodar in particular. And let's point that there. Okay, so obviously Professor Sava is not simply engaged in academic research. He's also very interested in trying to help other NGOs, trying to help us think about how we can resolve these problems. As such, he's managed to develop a number of particularly compelling policy recommendations. One of which, and perhaps the most important, is the need for increased legal support for both migrants and NGOs. Now that seems very obvious, but again, when we think about the situations these migrants face, especially when, as we've heard, they're put in deportation centers for up to a year at a time with very limited access to legal help, providing them with trained, skilled lawyers who have experience of migration issues, who have experience of deportation, and particularly have experience working with the FMS, the Federal Migratory Service in Russia, is incredibly important and really must be a focus of any attempt to resolve these problems. If there's a dearth of sufficiently trained lawyers in southern Russia, it's going to be impossible to help these people when they need it, and they're going to be deported back to their home countries or held in these deportation centers for far too long. So in particular, we need to see the territorial expansion of social networks. So it's great if we have fantastic resources in cities, but we know that a lot of the migrants don't live in cities. They live in very remote areas where they don't have access to networks. We saw some very compelling network analysis earlier today. So one of the things that Professor Sava hopes to achieve is to expand the social network of his organization and other NGOs to really cover the territories where we do see migrants. And training of legal representatives who have knowledge and specific competency in immigration law, which is a somewhat arcane topic in any state. When we think about NGOs, some of you may have seen recently that USAID was kicked out of Russia for alleged political interference. There have also been dramatic changes to the Russian law on registration of foreign NGOs in terms of funding. So clearly, having people who are skilled in helping local NGOs with their registration, with ongoing legal challenges from the Russian state, is incredibly important. This is not to say there are no people in the Russian state who want to help NGOs. It's just a very fraught territory, and the language and knowledge required is extremely complex. So it's not just about helping migrants, it's about helping the groups that want to help migrants have the resources to do what they need to do. I've talked about the FMS already. The local FMSs throughout the regions of Russia are an incredibly important processing point when it comes to migration. Beth and I tried to talk to people at the FMS, and they were not very receptive to our overtures, but the resources like the Southern Russian Resource Council, other NGOs like that who have strong contacts with the FMS are an incredibly important help for the migrants. They have the knowledge, they have the contacts, they have the ability to help these people who fall into particularly difficult situations. And knowing which NGOs have those links and being able to support those NGOs is incredibly important. And the final one, and I think is something which we've heard a little bit about earlier in Professor Mitchneck's research on the return problem, is thinking about the origin countries. So we need, or Professor Sava's organization and we as scholars and people interested in questions of migration need to think very carefully about how people are acquiring information before they arrive in a host country. So it's great if you have the resources in place to help them when they get there, and particularly when they get in trouble. It would be so much better if we could have literature that we'd send to local NGOs before they arrived, so they knew they had a network of contacts, they knew the Russian laws or the laws of any host country, they knew what they were expecting to do when they arrived. And I think this is something that came out of the Tashkent meeting, and something that really needs to be a focus of policy discussions as we move forward with this, is thinking about how to build links between NGOs who are all working on the same issues in different countries. So that's all I have to say. I'd like to thank Professor Sava for a particularly interesting paper, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. We've got a lot of very well-timed people here. And I would like to introduce our discussant today. She wasn't able to make this morning, I think, so Susan Martin, Director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really, after hearing the papers this afternoon, I'm even more sorry that I wasn't able to be here for the morning discussions. I was teaching. Unfortunately, that's something academics have to do every once in a while, and often interferes with hearing interesting papers. What I want to do is first comment a bit on the specific papers, but then open it up to the broader issue of the subject of this panel in terms of what are some future migration research opportunities, and give some thoughts in that area. I was really pleased that this session, though, started with discussing data and measurement estimation issues. I should say, by just a note of my own background, I'm an academic who often masquerades as a policy maker. Some people think it's the reverse way around, but I've gone back and forth between academia and the policy world for a long time, and I often, in the policy context, I'm somebody who has to translate research and data for members of Congress or president or cabinet members people of that ilk. So the weaknesses in the evidence base is so clearly a problem, not only in terms of the academic research on migration, and this is general because I do enough discussions with policymakers from other countries that I know that the US or Russia are not unique in this being a problem. So it impedes the research clearly, as we heard, and it also does impede the policy relevance of the information that's collected. I was glad also that there was some discussion of the political uses, though, within that context of estimations, because I think it's really very, very important to keep in mind that whatever methodology is used, whatever the sources of data, there will be a tendency to either over or underestimate the data based on very serious political considerations. I was doing some work in Jordan on urban refugees in the last few months, and this was before the large, or we don't know how large, influx of Syrians, but this was just on the Iraqis. And at the start of the Iraq War, or in 2006, when the large numbers started coming out of Iraq, Jordan claimed there were 800,000 Iraqis. There was an expert study, and they thought it was much, much lower. The number that is currently used, 450,000 or so, is a negotiated number. It has no scientific validity whatsoever. Best guesstimates of other people, it's probably somewhere in the 100,000 range. So, I mean, and there are lots of things that are contingent. Jordan obviously wants high numbers because it gets money as a result of it. Others want to underestimate numbers because it has various different other implications. So the political uses of estimates, extremely important need. One of the things that I think we as scholars don't do enough with is determining how administrative data can be, number one, improved, and number two, utilized. We tend to focus on census data or create our own surveys, but there's an awful lot that is collected just in the course of running programs, and trying to have that data be better collected in terms of what is collected, how it's collected, and how it's then conveyed to the research community is an important part of improving data and make it more useful for estimations. Not least of that is the absence very often of really good demographic data in terms of age and gender, and it's really hard to, I know even a place like the US will fall into the trap on that. The Immigration Service a number of years ago decided to change their data collection process and went to a new contractor. They went over all of the data elements and decided there was no real reason to collect age or sex for any of the admissions data. We have been dealing with that gap of a couple of years until they realized that, yeah, we really do need to know what the age and sex will be. And this is the theme that has come out and certainly came out in the very last comment on Mikhail's paper. I don't believe that we're ever going to get improvements in estimations unless we have more cooperation between source and destination countries. I don't think you can do it from either source. And in the case of the Russian, the emigration from Central Asia and from other countries into Russia, the need for starting to build networks between the scholars and researchers in the source and the destination country, I think is an absolutely essential part of improving not only the data, but then our understanding of what that data mean. One of the reasons that the Pew Center does incorporate Mexican data into their estimations, and I think it's very valuable that they do so, is because we had a binational research project in the 1990s and discovered that our two data sets didn't match. And it was simple things like they weren't counting entire households who moved to the US, so they were missing a lot of immigration of entire households. We were collecting the data at different times of the year, so we were missing seasonal workers. There were lots of things, and until we actually sat down and put the data together, could we figure out where those gaps were and trying to match emigration with immigration data. And I think it's not just at the NGO level or the government level, but I think it has to be also at the scholarly level. Turning to Alejandra's paper, I'm not an economist, I'm actually an historian who does a lot of public policy, so I won't even start with the ariths and the codes and stuff like that. I actually have learned to read them, which amazes me. But I'm really glad that there is work being done in trying to do equilibrium models and trying to put everything into the framework. But starting with the neoclassical economic model as your starting point really hides an awful lot. And I think the lesson from that, in my view, is that also we really need multidisciplinary research that is able to bring in the various different perspectives. I love the last panel because it really did show how you can take the same data and work it from different disciplines, and then try to put it back together with all of the different disciplinary perspectives. But as I was hearing the presentation and after having read the paper on it, I just began to think, well, what about networks? What about household effects rather than the rational actor? What other kind of risk management processes are going on in terms of the wide range of issues? What are the environmental factors? What are the political factors? I mean, just so many things that I think we know have an important impact on decisions on migration, and also on the impact of migration in terms of wage rates, et cetera, on that. And then with Mikhail's paper, I think this intersection of research and policy is an avenue that really is to be welcomed, but really needs to be moved ahead in different respects. In terms of the body of information, the kind of training, how information is transferred from the research community to the policy community, how the research questions that the policy community have are conveyed back to the research community, are all things that we don't do well in almost any migration context. Partly because it's often very divisive relationship between the often very liberal concepts of researchers in this field and the sometimes more control-oriented concepts of policymakers. And so working on that issue. Doing work in detention centers, I give you kudos. I know how difficult it is in the United States to do that type of research. I was struck by the terminology that was used in terms of temporary slavery. We would call it trafficking. We would refer to our Trafficking Victims Protection Act and focus on different mechanisms for addressing the problem within that legal framework that is both international and domestic. Can I take another minute quickly? Fortunately, they stopped early, so I have another couple of minutes. But more generally, in terms of the research, I've touched on some of my views on this. But given that the research in this particular region is dealing with countries that are still in transition, and important from that point of view. I think there are a number of questions that I would be interested in knowing more about in the research, and frankly haven't found it enough to know quite where we're going with it. One is on the role of migration, diasporas, et cetera, in terms of their impact on governance, on the rule of law, on institution building, all of those factors in the transition from a central to market economy, from authoritarian to democratic systems, et cetera, and sometimes back the other way. Second thing is the impact on health and education in particular, and we heard a little bit about some of those issues, but I think particularly in Russia, impact on health, I think is a very important issue given some of the statistics on that. Environmental factors, a lot of concerns now generally about the impact of climate change on migration and displacement. This is a region, again, where there are serious environmental factors at work. What role do they play? Mixed migration flows from places like Georgia, where it's not as clean as saying you've got refugees, you've got labor migrants. These are very mixed motive people, mixed flows themselves in terms of who's there. How do you untangle that type of mixture of forced and voluntary migration? Internal versus international. Again, this is a great place to try to see how those two issues, people who were internal migrants are now international, et cetera, just figuring out that process. One of the things that really hit me on the migration and development discussion, I like the postponed development concept that was presented earlier, but I've just been going through poverty reduction strategy papers, including some from the region, from the Central Asian countries, and none of what we know about migration turns up in any of them. So it's in that particular area where countries are thinking about development, how do we get what we know about migration and its impacts in there? And finally, the issue of IRBs, institutional review boards. This may be one of the most difficult types of research to get past any kind of human subjects review. I think we have to talk more as researchers about how we manage to construct research projects with often irregular populations, people without legal status, hidden population that truly protects the human subjects but allows the research to go forward.
Well, thank you very much. We can stay late and have a session on IRBs. We're in the middle of some of those issues right now as I look at Julia and Jesse. In any case, thank you very much. I would like to give any of the panelists an opportunity to respond to Susan's very rich comments. Would anyone like to respond?
Yes, thank you for your comments and for recommendation how to improve our research. Thank you.
No, Cindy? Great. Well, we have a few minutes left to open up to the floor. Igor.
Thanks. So I just would like to echo Professor Martin's commentary on Alexandra's work. I'd also would like to specify that there has been, for example, the new economics of labor migration theory promoted by Douglas Macy and others, which provides a much richer understanding of the economics underlying migration decision-making. But of course, there's a lot of factors you can take into account, and a model can only do so much. But you said that you proved your model through data that you seem to have gotten from the Russian Federation, the Rosdata, and it seemed like that would not necessarily be a very effective way of proving your model because the data leaves out a huge number of people. The flows to Russia are extremely informal and unofficial, and I find it difficult to believe that you could truly show the real dynamics of the situation. So maybe I misunderstood how you were using the data or where you were getting it from. And I also just wanted to say one other thing to Professor Sava's, and maybe maybe I'll say it in Russian and then. Я чувствовал, что ваше исследование очень важно, и вы почти все правильно объясняли, и это было действительно очень интересно для меня, я уверен, для всех. Меня только интересует вот главный вопрос, почему, и это тоже связывается с предыдущей панелью, почему Краснодар и вот почему она так разделяется от других частей России? Я не очень понимаю, какие там динамики вот действительно так меняют, почему там такие трудности. Это для меня просто интересно. И последнее, я только хотел сказать, что вот ваш последний вопрос, который Оливер там объяснял, про того, что это очень важно иметь вот связи с странами, которые от которой мигранты выезжают. Я просто хочу сказать, что я последние пару лет делал исследования в Киргизии и Таджикистане, и там сейчас очень много работы, тем более в это МОМА, Международная организация миграции, которая как раз восстанавливает эти связи. И это просто соединяет вот в моем вопросе к Александру, что, к сожалению, они не могут добраться для большинства мигрантов. Сейчас есть очень много центров, огромное количество НПО и даже формальные официальные организации, которые... И новое министерство как раз было создано в Таджикистане в этом году, которое как раз работает на обучение мигрантов, и они точно знают все законы. К сожалению, они просто не могут их выполнять, когда они приезжают в Россию. Вот святки и коррупция очень серьезная проблема, и большинство людей просто не приезжают легально. So, I just want to say that basically the research that was presented by Professor Sava and Oliver was very, very interesting, and I wanted to understand what the difference was in the dynamics of Krasnodar, why it was such a kind of a unique case, seemingly, in Russia, and also to mention the fact that there was, in fact, a lot of connections that were trying to be made between Russian and sending countries, specifically Central Asia, mostly held together by the IOM. But unfortunately, because of the illicit and informal nature of the migration process, there has been a lot of sort of empty space in terms of migrants not really being covered by these efforts. So the conversation in Tashkent, I think, was on the right track, and it's already underway. So those are my comments. Sorry if it took a bit long. Thanks.
Thank you.
Спасибо за вопросы. Я попрошу Оливера перевести мои ответы. Первый вопрос Игоря касался специфики Краснодарского края. И я думаю, есть два компонента этой специфики. Первый такой ментальный, поскольку традиционное сознание значительной части населения Краснодарского края достаточно конфронтационно. Это то, что можно назвать современным вариантом такой казачьего восприятия мира.
So in answer to the first question about the unique dynamics of Krasnodar, Professor Sava thinks there are two things. The first of which is the perception or the mental aspect. He says that the consciousness or the feeling in Krasnodar is traditionally quite confrontational.
Например, Краснодар стоит на реке, но у нас еще 5 лет назад не было набережной, потому что за рекой, за Кубанью, Адыгея. И в течение многих десятилетий, даже 2 столетий, я бы сказал, по реке проходила военная граница.
So for those of you who don't know, Krasnodar is located on the bank of a river, and across that river is Adygea, which is a very different ethnic group to the Russians. And Professor Sava mentioned that it's, over the past 200 years, often been a source of conflict or a site of conflict.
И второй компонент политический. Наш предыдущий губернатор Кондратенко очень резко политизировал проблему миграции. Его 4-летний период правления привел к тому, что в общественном мнении достаточно надолго закрепилось восприятие миграции исключительно в качестве негативного явления.
So the second aspect is political, and Professor Savas is arguing that the former governor of Krasnodar, Kondratenko, politicized immigration and particularly worked to reinforce the perception of immigration as a purely negative phenomenon.
Объективно ситуация в сфере миграции изменилась, но она воспринимается еще так, как была тогда сформирована в общественном мнении.
So the objective reality of migration has changed significantly, but the perception of migration has remained broadly the same in Krasnodar.
И второй вопрос, связанный с необходимостью горизонтальных связей между странами, принимающими, между территориями, принимающими мигрантов, и территориями исхода мигрантов. Ответ следующий. Безусловно, уже сейчас существуют такие взаимодействия, в том числе через сеть международной организации по миграции, с которой мы сотрудничаем.
So with regard to the question of the horizontal links between the NGOs in the countries that receive and send migrants, Professor Savas says that there currently clearly exist a number of cooperation networks between those two between organizations in those places.
Большая часть тех случаев, когда нам удалось освободить людей из рабства на территории Краснодарского края, это были ситуации, когда информация проходила по следующей цепочке. Мигрант в Краснодарском крае случайно получал доступ к мобильному телефону, звонил своим родственникам в Ташкентскую область, те обращались в офис Международной организации по миграции в Ташкенте, через офис МОМ в Москве эта информация приходила к нам.
So the Professor Sava, forgive me if I'm a little bit eliding some of this. The main means by which people were formally freed from this temporary slavery or these detention centers were that an individual would have access to a mobile phone, would call their contact in their hometown or their home city. This contact would go to an organization in said home city, and the organization would then contact a local organization to work on getting that individual freed.
А мы уже организовывали акцию миграционной службы, которые приезжали на это предприятие и освобождали людей.
Then the local organizations would work with the migration service to free these people.
Но сейчас стоит задача создать настолько плотную сеть взаимодействия, чтобы эта информация проходила быстрее, с меньшим количеством посредников вот в этой информационной сети.
So the current task is to work on increasing the density of these links so that information is passed more quickly without quite as many intermediaries.
Например, в Узбекистане есть некоммерческая организация «Истыкбали Авлод», отделение которой действует в каждой области и фактически в каждом городе.
So in Uzbekistan, there currently exists an organization which is present in every city and in fact every district of Uzbekistan.
И нашей задачей является сделать так, чтобы наши контакты стали прямыми.
And Professor Sava would like it that his organization becomes the main point of contact.
Спасибо.
Thank you. We are a few minutes past 5. So with your indulgence, I would ask two things. One, if Liz has any remarks about tomorrow, to let me know, symbol. And if there is a question by someone who will not be joining us tomorrow or later on that you would like to get on the table, please raise your hand and we can indulge another question. I'm not seeing that. So, Liz, I'll ask you to lead us in some direction.
So, for tonight's dinner, if anyone, this is for the speakers, if anyone needs directions, doesn't have to please come see me. And tomorrow, for all the speakers, we'll be meeting in the 4th floor conference room at 9 o'clock.
And Liz,
Everyone else, I just want to thank everyone else for coming today, and we really appreciate your participation.
and there's one entrance open tomorrow morning?
Yes, the doors right by the Wilson Center will not be open tomorrow, but you can go in the middle of the building and then come through.
Thank you. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you all for joining us today.